Okay, we are back. Hair is pulled back because we are about to get into post-processing. I know this is a big one for a lot of people. We are going to spend a whole unit on post-processing and some best practices when you do it. In this lesson, we're really just going to be talking about the difference between RAW versus JPEG and why you would choose one over the other. Some people, they start their photography journey, and influencers, I'll say, teachers, workshop presenters, people like me will say, well, you need to shoot in RAW. Everything should be shot in RAW. Oh, actually. Yeah, that's nonsense. First, a lot of people, JPEG is enough. So we're going to talk about why JPEG might be a good choice for you or why RAW might be a good choice for you. Remember, this is about you. It's not about what you're supposed to do. It's what works for you. So quickly, what is JPEG? JPEG is actually an acronym. It is an organization. They invented it. JPEG is the most common file type. That's the one that most of the pictures you're looking at online are mostly in JPEG. They are perfectly reasonable sizes and quality. You will hear PNGs being thrown around as well. PNGs just tend to be a little bit bigger, maybe have a little bit more information saved in them. But for general sharing, even working with clients, if you end up in the paid world, let's say you have portrait clients, you're probably going to be delivering JPEGs. Okay, so JPEGs are the most common. That's what you're finding. RAW is not a specific file type. Every camera has their own version. Camera manufacturer has their own version of RAW files. RAW files are basically the ingredients, the data that will be then cooked or created to make the image the way you want. So there's a lot more information in a RAW file than in a JPEG. It also means that you have to post-process it. You cannot just share a RAW file. You might think that you can because sometimes you'll see a picture and someone said this is the RAW. It's not really, it's the RAW that's then been converted into probably a JPEG and just the person didn't put any of their own post-processing on it. Now, the conversation often turns to, well, if you're editing RAW, what is cheating? What is too much? What is this? What is that? I want you to remember that a JPEG has also been post-processed. You just didn't do it. The camera did it for you. Now, some cameras will have profiles built into them. Fuji does beautiful ones. I haven't really explored my Sony ones yet because I like post-processing and I have my own version of that, my own color style and so forth. So for me, I haven't tried it, but I know they have some as well. And I believe every camera, I don't want to say every camera, but a lot of cameras have profiles built into them now that you can choose from. But when you export your pictures, or even when you just take a picture in JPEG, it has been post-processed by the camera in one way or the other. So are you a control freak that needs to make sure that every pixel has been seen by you and changed by you and addressed by you? Then you want to kind of move into RAW. Are you happy with the way the pictures come out of your camera? Do you hate post-processing? Do you not have the time? Are you just taking pictures for your own memories and you just want to get them up right away? JPEG is great for that. I kind of fall in the place where I shoot JPEG and RAW because sometimes you'll be out and you'll take a picture and you really love it and you want to share it right away and you don't want to go home and import it and all that. So I have the JPEG there that I can then just send to my phone and then send up to the space. And then go home and maybe work on the RAW file if I want to, or of the other images while I was out shooting. So this is entirely a personal preference. So let's talk about some benefits that each one has over the other. So when you are choosing JPEG, you are choosing a smaller file size, which means that you can fit more on that card of yours. You are choosing an ease of sharing, meaning it's much quicker and much easier for you to get that out to the world. It has a simplified editing and faster workflow because you don't need to edit it at all, and you maybe just want to organize it and put it somewhere safe. You can also do some in-camera adjustments with JPEG files. A lot of cameras will allow you to shift white balance, exposure, and stuff in the camera, and then just export it as a JPEG from your camera directly. And then this one doesn't get talked about a lot, but continuous shooting. So what that means is JPEGs are much smaller. So if you are shooting like sports, for example, and you want to make sure you get that perfect shot of the ball being kicked, and you hold down and you do continuous shooting like that, RAW files take a while to save to the card. JPEGs don't. They take much less time because they're much smaller. So you can hold it down and you can get this burst of shots really quickly. In fact, a lot of sports photographers and photojournalists shoot exclusively in JPEG, both for the speed of it and also because they need to get it to their editor right away. So they'll shoot all of them in JPEG, and then they'll send them to whomever, their agency, right directly there on the scene. Photojournalists often have to shoot JPEG as well for journalistic purposes, just to make sure that nothing has been changed or processed by the photographer. So there are like actual professional applications of JPEG over RAW as well. There are some limitations, and I'm going to show that in a editing video below. But some of the limitations that you'll find is you can't really adjust white balance. When you do try to post-process JPEGs, you can't really be very subtle. It's very difficult to be very subtle. If you shift color, it's going to go like all the way over here, as opposed to being a little bit more careful and slow like you can with RAW. So you just don't have as much processing power when you are shooting in JPEG. But there are a lot of benefits to it as well, depending on what kind of photographer you are and what your ultimate goals are. So let's talk about RAW then. So some advantages to RAW. With a RAW file, you are getting a higher image quality. There is more data and more information stored in a RAW file than there is in a JPEG. You are getting a greater dynamic range, meaning you can pull back those highlights and shadows at a much better way than you can on a JPEG file. There's a lot of hidden information in a RAW file that you can't even see until you start moving those sliders around in your post-processing software. You have non-destructive editing. Most editing software is non-destructive, but with RAW files, you can always go back to that RAW file. Any adjustment you made can be taken out, can be altered at a later date. When you are finished with a RAW file, you export it as a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF, whatever it is. JPEG is the common one, like I said. And then you still have that RAW file. So you have the new edit that you just did, but you still have the RAW file that you can always go back to. The big one for me is white balance adjustments. A lot of people are like, I don't know what white balance setting to put my camera in, you know, especially if I'm going inside and outside and I'm moving from tungsten light to daylight to this, to that. It doesn't matter when you shoot RAW. When you shoot RAW, you can completely change that white balance and it works with no issue. So in your post-processing software. So fine-tuning white balance is a huge one for RAW over JPEG. The same kind of goes for exposure. You have a lot more latitude with exposure, with color correction. Those things are definitely more adjustable in a RAW file than they are in a JPEG. Other editing options like sharpness, perspective, lens corrections, these are all much more adjustable with a RAW file. So again, the big thing for RAW, most of those things that I list are about post-processing. So if post-processing doesn't matter to you, then consider that. There are some things that maybe are worth thinking about even if you are not a post-process kind of guy, but RAW files have all of your sensor data on them. That means that it's very future-proof. It's like having the original film after you get your film developed. You can always go back and pull all that data back onto it. It's also a nice way to prove copyright, but we won't get into that right now. But if you have the RAW file, that's like having all the ingredients for the cake before the cake is made. So you can say, no, these are my ingredients. I can make the cake however I want later on. So that's just something to consider as well. As far as some disadvantages to RAW, they're quite big. So you won't be able to fit as many images on your SD card, but storage is relatively cheap now. So you can get more smaller cards or more bigger cards, and kind of keep that in mind as well. I do recommend, formatting your card regularly. So making sure that you put that information somewhere else. And we're going to talk about that in our next lesson here. But RAW files are quite big. And they do require you to post-process. So those are the two big disadvantages to them, unless you like post-processing like me. So keep that in mind. Below, you're going to see a couple of videos just demonstrating what it actually looks like when you try to post-process a RAW file versus a JPEG. So take a look at those, and then I'll see you in the last lesson of this unit.